Begin in 1 second, inshallah ta'ala. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد. We finished Sunan al-Ghusl in our last class. Today we're going to be picking up from فصل في شروط الطهارة من الحدثين. The author here says وشروط الطهارة عن الحدث الأصغر والأكبر al-Islam, because in order for the act to count, the individual needs to be Muslim. What tamyiz? See, he did not say al-bulugh, he said at-tamyiz. وما هو التمييز عندنا? التمييز عند أصحابنا is an age where the child knows how to eat, drink, and clean themselves after using the restroom on their own. If the child can do this, then they are called a mumayyaz. وَالْمَاءُ الطَّاهِرُ الْمُطَهِّرُ. Water that's clean in itself and clean for others to use. فَلَا يَصَحُّ رَفْعُ الْحَدَثِ وَلَا إِزَالَةُ النَّجَسِ إِلَّا بِالْمَاءِ الْمُطْلَقِ. When we say al-ma' al-mutlaq, what we mean by al-mutlaq, al-mutlaq here is not a qaid per se, it's more of a description. It means what would be called water, period. That's it. Jameel. And that which would be called water only, period, end of story, is what we refer to in our school as al-ma' al-mutlaq. He says, وَهُوَ مَا نَزَلَ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ أو نبع من الأرض. أو نبع من الأرض. There's a lot of debate on that definition, on that breakdown. And the reason why I'm pointing this out here is that it is a very famous statement. And it's used by a lot of ulama. And the debate goes back to the origins of this statement. The origins of this statement is another statement, and that is water as was created, as long as it stays in the state in which it was created in. That statement, while trying to summarize everything, and it does sound decent, it's problematic. Why is it problematic? Because when it rains and that rain goes into the ocean, that rainwater has changed from the state that it came in. It didn't come down salt water, but now it's salt water. So in order to solve that problem, they limited the statement to any water that falls from the sky or comes up from the ground. And they didn't say anything else. They didn't add in that phrase of, and it remains on the same state it was when it was made or created or came, etc. Bottom line, if the water can normally be called water, then it is water. Ocean water, the word ocean has no impact here. Salt water, as long as the salt water is from the sea or the ocean, it has no effect here. If the water wasn't salty, or even if it was salty and I wanted to make it a little bit extra salty, so I went and got mountain salt and added it to it, I just ruined it. You might say, but it's salt and that's salt water. What's the big deal? It's a big deal because that salt doesn't belong in that water. Tamam? I love Imam al-Shafi'i's breakdown of water, especially in the West. You know, in the East, you don't really find this. You know, Imam al-Shafi'i is probably the most scholar that's ever spoken about celery that I've ever seen. When I was growing up in Egypt, I mean, I heard of celery. I know people ate celery, but it was something very rare that anyone had celery. In America, celery is something part of every meal and a lot of different dishes, and people snack on it normally. So you have to love that. And why he mentioned celery, he said, if you put celery into water, it doesn't change anything. Even if you call it ma'ul karafs, it doesn't change anything, because that additional description did not change the value of the water. As opposed to dumping tea into a water, what happens? It changes it. Tamam? So if that water is changed in any way that would impact my usage, then I cannot use that for wudu, nor can I use it to remove filth from something else. فَإِن تَغَيَّرَ طَعْمُ الْمَاءِ, the taste of water, if it changed, or its color, أو لونه, أو ريحه, or its scent, تَغَيُّرًا فَاحِشًا, a change that is very noticeable. بِمُخَالَطِ, مخالط is something that mixes with the water, as opposed to something that's mujawir, that doesn't mix with water, it just fell into it. In other words, you can remove it with ease, as opposed to something that mixes, like dumping coffee into water. The only way to divide that is to take it to a lab and break it down on a molecular level, right? That's not going to happen, and you might not be able to do that. Kalam Jameel. That's called mukhalit, as opposed to mujawir. It doesn't normally mix, you can just pull it right out. So if water and one of its three characteristics change, a noticeable change with something that is tahir, yastaghni al-ma'u anhu, it had no business being there. Like what our fuqaha like to use, for example, actually my Sheikh Mukhtasar, his favorite example is, imagine out of a river, right in the middle, several trees start to grow. A little tiny piece of land and trees. And then let's imagine that those trees are a group of fruit trees and tea trees. The leaves from the tea trees fall into the water. What do tea trees do? They'll dye the water, right? Right. But would that impact the water? If it's excessively changed, yes. If it's minor, then no. Why? Because no one goes around collecting leaves on, normally people don't do that. So if it's falling into the water, it's going to fall into the water. But what if the fruit tree dropped its apples into the water and the apples impacted the water? That's a problem. Why? Because no one leaves fruit on a tree just sitting there. It's normally adatan collected. Tamam? He says, so if that thing does not need to be there, like saffron, which is excessively expensive. I don't know why anyone would drop saffron into water. Wal ushnan, and a lot of the mashayikh, they'll just say like a bar of soap. Wal just, it's white cement, but also other varieties of cement would be included here. Wal nurati, types of clay and rocks that are not normally around the water. Wal kuhl, eyeliner, whether it's ismit, which is the medical type that the Sahaba, the Prophet ﷺ used to use, which is actually a red eyeliner, not a black one. I see a lot of brothers that start to get excited about ilm and all of that. They look like ancient Egyptians coming to class. I saw this all my life. It's not what they were doing. It's not the kuhl that it's mentioned in the ahadith. He says, "Lam tujiz at-taharatu bih." So if that water with something foreign that's not normally there fell into the water and changed it in a very noticeable way, hissi or taqdiri, meaning you saw the change or you hypothetically ran a simulator of what just happened in your head with exchanging the current substance with another substance. And in the simulation that you ran in your head, or what you see with your eyes, is changing it, a very noticeable change, then you have a problem. He says, وَلَا يَضُرُّ التَّغَيُّرُ بِالْمُكْثِ. You know, you go to a pool that has been covered for a year. Take the cover off the pool, and we see this in the West all the time, right? A pool behind someone's house, a pool in a torn down hotel. Once you take the cover off, you'll notice that all on top of the water, there's a big green thick layer. Normally, you could just use like a rake or a shovel and just move that layer off the top. And the water underneath, it's water, but it's a little greenish from sitting there. That does not change the water. Why? Because that's what water does. If the area is not ventilated and flowing normally, it turns into a swamp. That's just what water does. Therefore, that is a normal behavior and action that's happening with the water. And since that's the case, we cannot allow this sitting that the water did have an impact. That's al-mukth. What about at-turab? At-turab is dirt. Well, it's not going to impact because dirt does not mix with water. And as a matter of fact, there's an interesting debate between Shafi'i scholars on this matter. If the flow of the water is so strong that the dirt becomes consistently and regularly flowing into the water, some Shafi'i scholars said that would be mukhalit, not mujawir. The majority of the Shafi'i, however, said no, it's not a mixer. Dirt, sand does not mix with water. It will settle at some point. So then it's mujawir, not mukhalit. And for the most part, we consider it mujawir, not mukhalit. So, I mean, all you have to do is let it settle to the bottom, and then you can use the water. So the dirt itself does not impact the water. What tuhlub? And now, tuhlub is realistically an umbrella name for many different water type plant life. It's more of an umbrella term. Tamam. Now, some scholars specify and state that it is only referring to tuhlub of water. Kalam Jameel. If we say it only means that, then we're referring to that algae and that turns up like green moss all over the top of water. Jameel. However, if you dive into the Shafi'i Fiqh books, you'll see for the most part, they're speaking about any type of water plant that is growing underneath and eventually comes to the surface. In either cases, if there's a plant and the plant is a water-based, whether it's algae, fungi, bacteria type, or it looks like a regular plant and seaweed, they do not impact the water. This one or that one. And even if you don't consider other aqua vegetation, if you may, as tuhlub, well, then it'll go right back to the first example where we said ما يستغني عنه الماء وما لا يستغني عنه الماء. Because if it's from the water, then it'll have other categories that will still say it's okay for it to be there, even if it's not classified under tuhlub. وما في مقره وممره. Al-maqar, it means the waterbed itself. Now, oceans, seas, rivers, major lakes, normally it's not a big issue. The issue really comes up in farming more than anything else, and in farmlands, because farms are usually not on the bank of a river, but rather off of the bank slightly, maybe a few miles inland. And what they'll do is that they'll run a canal, sometimes kind of small, and that floods and fills into a pool of water that they use, a little lake that they use, or a little reservoir that they fill. Along the path of that canal is where you have issues. What's the first issue? Well, what if someone took something filthy and put it at the canal? Well, then everyone's mind usually is like, well, everyone in the village, in the farm, is getting filthy water. No, it's not the case. What's in the maqar, the bottom, the water bed, or the mamar, does not automatically impact everything. Since it's going to empty out into a reservoir, if that reservoir is over 2 qullah, that water is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, here comes the follow-up question. What about what's in the canal if it's not qullatin? Okay, perfect. For one, why don't we just take it out if we can get it out that easy? If we can't, then go away to in an area where the water is 2 qullah, then use it. Jameel, and that's where the famous statement comes, what? We have thousands of qulal, they're all najis. And they're talking about every flow of water over that little canal. Because all day long the water's flowing, going in to fill up the reservoir, right? So all of this flow, all of this water, thousands of qulal, and they're all najis until they reach the reservoir where all the water is gathered in the village or in the farm. He said, وَلَا التَّغَيُّرُ بِالْمُجَاوَرَةِ. If it's something that's not mixing, kalam jameel, and it's not going to harm. You got a licorice stick. It looks like a suet, right? And you put it into the water. Licorice sticks is a little bit hard. It might take a few days to even make an effect, but it never really doesn't make an effect because it's a piece of wood. It's a branch. Just take it out. In Egypt, they used to sell these little blocks of musk. And it looks like a little tiny bar of soap, but it's actually not soap. You rub it on your hands and into your beard. And you get this mild musk scent. It's beautiful. Jameel, take it out. A bar of soap, take it out. These things do not normally mix. Some of them might mix eventually down the road, like a bar of soap will eventually melt. But normally they don't. Just take it out. And I give this example. Ka'udin, I give you an example like a licorice stick. وَالدُّهْنِ الْمُطَيَّبِ. And that could be a handful of hair gel. It won't normally mix right away. Or a hair oil, or coconut hair butter. Actually, it's really thick, almost like butter. And it's oily. So if I were to take a spoonful of it and toss it in, it'll sit there for a very long time before disintegrating and coming apart. He says, وَلَا يَصِحُ الطَّهَارَةُ بِمَا تُطُهِّرَ بِهِ مِنْ حَدَثٍ أَوْ نَجَسٍ. And that's الماء المستعمل. الماء المستعمل, that has to do with the water that falls off of your limbs as you're making wudu. That which is falling off of your arms. That's called musta'mal. The najis normally is not called musta'mal. Normally when we speak about what's left over from removing najis, we're speaking about ghusala. Imagine you have a shirt, an ink pen blew up on that shirt. You soak the shirt, you rub the shirt, you have a bowl with water that you're using and it's in and out. That water in that bowl is called ghusala. When your washing machine drains out, after the first wash, it drains all that water out, that water going out is called ghusala. It's called ghusala. But the example he's giving us here pertains to what would be similar to musta'mal. The other one, they'll normally just use it when they're speaking about cleaning off an object, a shirt, the floor, clothes. With the skin, they'll still call it مستعمل, but they'll add a قيد and they'll say مستعمل في إزالة نجاسة. Jameen, used water cannot be used. One, because it's disgusting. Two, because the Sahaba didn't do it, or should I reverse them and make the Sahaba not doing it as one? Jameel. And three is because this water, you cannot guarantee its purity. More than likely, we have things on our skin that we do not see. We already know we have bacteria on our hand that we cannot see. So what else could be in there? And if I was cleaning najasa off myself, that's even worse. Some people come and say, La, وَيَجُوز, and there's nothing wrong with this, and you guys are making this stuff up. No, we're not making this stuff up. The Sahaba, the Prophet ﷺ, they had an extreme shortage of water. And not once did anyone ever say, Fulan, please make wudu over this bucket so we can collect it afterwards. No, they made wudu and the water was on the ground. Jameel. طيب. He says تنبيه. لو أدخل المتوضئ يده بعد غسل وجهه جميعه مرة أو الجنب بعد النية في ماء دون القلتين فاغترف ونوى الاغتراف لم يضر وإن لم ينوى الاغتراف صار الباقي مستعملا. Really simple, because this issue, we don't even use it anymore. We don't even speak about it anymore. Not to mention, we don't even make wudu the same way anymore. So, in all simplicity and easiness, if you're making wudu out of a bucket and you wash your hands, you make your madmada and istinshaq, you know, we already went over this, your wudu technically begins when you start washing your face. So, everything before sunnah, it's not going to take a big impact here. You go and get a handful of water for your face and you run it down your face that first time. The water that's on your hands is now considered what? Musta'mal, because it still has water that you wiped off of your face, on and off, right? Mumtaz. So your hands are filled now with musta'mal water. If you're making wudu out of a handy bucket or bowl or container or pitcher, then probably has like what, 2-3 liters of water. If you put your hand in it and that's musta'mal on your hand, and you run the simulation that you had a hand of, I don't know, let's just say lemon juice on your hand and you put it in, would it have changed? Yes. Then in that case, since it's changing, Jameel, then we are going to go ahead and say that everything in that pitcher or bucket is musta'mal. But now, since we're speaking about a small bucket, regardless of the example that we're talking about, it will change. So, we need a solution. Some of the Shafi'i ulama came and said, here's a solution. I need to make wudu. Only tools I have are my 2 hands. Ya Rab, I'm making an extra intention. Please allow me to use my hands as like a mug or a ladle to get water out. So they said, if they make that intention, that should suffice the issue. If not, then he just made that water musta'mal, he never made wudu. But the majority of Shafi'i ulama, they said, it's best to ignore the existence of this whole mas'ala. Why? Because when you're analyzing a mas'ala in the Sharia, you should be focusing on what the Sharia told you to be focusing on. If there's an additional conclusion beyond what the Sharia told you, you should leave it alone. You should leave it alone. we know they had shortage of water. We know they barely had little bowls. Qas'a. It's a little bowl. It's not even, a qas'a can't even work for a soup bowl today. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ brought a bowl. He put his hand in it and he said to the Sahaba, come and make wudu from it. Bismillah. Didn't say anything about him pouring it on them, right? So they could have been taking water out themselves. So then the Sharia did not address that point. We should not get into it as well. Some people argue and say, but Imam Shafi'i, for example, he has some opinions that some people consider odd and beyond what the Sharia says. Like what? Regardless of what? A Shafi'i never, ever spoke when the Sharia was silent. If the Sharia stated it, he stuck to it, regardless of whatever mas'ala anyone wants to bring up. The whole reason why they object some of the statements of Imam Shafi'i, it's because what he said had nothing to do with logical conclusions, but rather what the Sharia said and did not say. And that's what we believe the majority of ulama did. Wallahu a'lam. So don't worry about that mas'ala at all. And many of the ulama of the Shafi'i school, from the time of Imam al-Ghazali till this very moment, said disregard it, disregard it, disregard it. Imam al-Ramli said, now, one might argue a scholar might be required to pay attention to this point. And that's a good observational note, that the scholar knows better. So he should be taking things into consideration. Wallahu a'lam. In our next fasl, he says, فصل وينجس الماء القليل وغيره من المائعات ولو بتكميله قلتين بوقوع النجاسة فيه. Water is either قليل, less than قلتين, or كثير, more than قلتين. If it's less than قلتين and filth has fallen into it, then it is najis, whether it changed it or not. If it is more than قلتين and najasa has fallen in, then we only consider it najis if one of the three characteristics have changed: the color, taste, and smell. ويعفى عن اليسير من الشعر النجس. Hair that is najis, jamil, that might be a strand here or there. There's nothing wrong there. You're forgiven on that. وعن الميتة التي لا نفس لها سائلة. Originally, this comes from the hadith. إذا وقع الذباب في شراب أحدكم فليغمسه ثم لا يطرحه فإن في أحد جناحيه داء وفي الآخر شفاء. If a fly falls into your drink, dip it and then pull it, because one wing has a cure and the other one, the one has a disease and the other one has a cure or the antidote for that. So we don't know if that individual insect will always have the two. We don't know if this includes all insects or not, but the dipping is just in case, and the qiyas is there as well because of the nature of that insect. What's unique about the fly? The Prophet ﷺ said dubab. Dubab is a fly, and that would include regular fly, the bigger flies, the fruit flies. Kalam jameel. Why? Well, the only unique thing about it that we can find is it doesn't release blood when it dies, as opposed to, for example, if we were to slaughter a sheep, there's going to be blood everywhere. But if we were to slaughter a fly, there's not going to be anything. So the Shafi'iyya took this to be that this would include basically all insects, all creatures. التي لا نفس لها سائلة. When you pluck an arm off, it does not start releasing blood everywhere. جميل. ولذلك they made قياس on that. والنجاسة التي لا يدركها الطرف. You were only judged by that which you can see and control. Jameel. So if it's something that you cannot see, you cannot determine that it's there, then therefore you're not liable about that, or when it comes to that. The Sharia didn't ask you to get a microscope and run your clothes through it at the end of the day. وَمَنْفَذِ الطَّيْرِ وَالْفَأْرِ. Mouths of birds and other animals, you're not required to look after them and see, well, where were they? Where did they go? وَالْيَسِيرْ مِنْ غُبَارِ السِّرْجِينَ. Sirjin, essentially, is a very broad term. It was originally used to refer to burning fertilizer on the ground before doing a final till, so you can start planting your seeds. And that's how it's used 99% of the time. And if you go to farmlands in many countries, you'll see smoke coming off of every land because they just laid down their fertilizer. However, it's also used at times to refer to burning trash. Now, little side note here, trash back then is different than trash today. Trash today is filled with plastic and other foreign objects. Trash back then was, I'm pretty sure there's probably no leftovers left. Let's just put that out there. And it was more natural things than things that we see today. So sirjin, or ghubar sirjin, the smoke from burning fertilizer, could to a certain extent include the concept of just burning najasa, because fertilizer is najis. So the smoke that comes off, that touches you, if it's minor, then it's okay. There's no harm to you and what you have on. If it's major, then there's no more afu. وسؤر الهرة التي أكلت نجاسة ثم غابت زمنا واحتمل بلوغها في قلتين من الماء. A cat catches a mouse. You see the blood running down its mouth and chin. It runs off to go enjoy its feast. It comes back an hour later. Everything looks clean. There's no more blood on it. Well, this could be an indication that after it ate, it went and it drank and cleaned itself, right? A child was playing amongst children that you were looking after. The child goes into their house, say these are houses on a street. He smelled like urine when he left. When he came back, he had a clean change of clothes on. How do you treat this? That the child is clean, because it looks like they might have changed. And this is a mas'ala called ta'arud al-asl wal-zahir. Ta'arud al-asl wal-zahir. What's the asl? Is that these things are tahir. But the zahir, what's apparent to you, is that something happened. Did that child actually wash himself from that urine? You don't know. Did that cat literally put its face into water, or did it just lick it off somehow? Or did it rub its face on the grass somehow? You don't know. The zahir is almost unknown, but leaning towards they're still najis. But since the Sharia didn't tell you to investigate here, then we're going to say you keep the asl. What's the asl? Is that the child has clean clothes on, he's clean, you don't smell anything, he's good to go. That cat is clean, you don't have to worry about it, it can share your dinner with you. The author says, فصل في حكم الماء إذا وقعت فيه نجاسة. وإذا كان الماء قلتين, if water was قلتين, ووقعت فيه نجاسة, and filth has fallen into it, فلا ينجس إلا إذا تغير طعمه أو لونه أو ريحه تغيرا كثيرا أو يسيرا. And we spoke about this moments ago. If the water is قلتين and above, and najasa has fallen into it, we do not call it najis unless one of its three characteristics have changed. An obvious or a minor change. It doesn't matter. He says, وَإِذَا زَالَ التَّغَيُّرُ بِنَفْسِهِ. But now if you left that water and you came back a day later and it looks like it's back to normal, then that's okay. Or what if you had another barrel of water and you just added water to that water that began to change? And that's okay. ولا يطهر إذا زال التغير بمسك أو زعفران أو جص أو تراب. We do not accept the water reverting back to its original state by using a chemical, by using za'faran or misk or jis or dirt, because these things are used to cover up the filth. So I have no way of knowing, did this cover or remove? But now if a scientist comes and says this chemical will destroy that najasa and remove it, not hide it, then that's a different story. He says, فصل في النجاسات. والنجاسة هي البول والغائط والروث والقيح والدم والقي. Filth for us in the Shafi'i madhab is urine and feces, animal dropping and casting, pus, blood, vomit, and also والخمر والنبيذ والمسكر, alcohol, wine, or any liquid intoxicant. So that would mean other drugs such as marijuana, hash, pills, those things would not be considered najis. They're not liquid. والكلب والخنزير وفرع أحدهما. The dog, everything in the dog. The pig, swine. Or if a dog were to mate with another animal, or a pig to mate with another animal, their offspring. Or using pieces of a dog or a pig in medical procedures to grow limbs, all of that would be najis. What about putting something from them in medication? If it's needed for pain or survivability, etc., then it's needed. الضرورة تبيح المحظورة. That which is forbidden is overturned when necessity hits. He also says from things that are najis, al-maytatu wa sha'ruha, and its hair, wa rishuha, and its feathers, wa jilduha, and its skin and hide, wa jami'u ajza'iha, and all of its pieces. What's al-mayta? Is an animal that died in a method that is not what the Sharia required to make it halal. Jamil. He says, and also, al-madh, and al-madh is pre-semen. When someone is aroused, they usually release a liquid. That liquid is called madhi. How do we know this? Because I recently read a sharh for someone, one of those people that claim to be Shafi'i and obviously are not, but he said in a book that he was explaining, that's a Shafi'i Fiqh book, he said the Shafi'iyya only have dalil for urine and feces. Everything else they made qiyas on urine and feces. This is not true. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa karram Allahu wajhahu sent al-Miqdad to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam to tell him there's a man that has a lot of madhi that releases. What should he do? So the Prophet ﷺ said, tell Ali to wash the area, wash himself, and make wudu. So that right there is a sahih narration about madhi. Wadi, sure, we could argue that this might be qiyas. Kalam Jameel. Wadi happens for two reasons. Old age and someone with a bad back that's lifting heavy things. What happens is that when they strain, they start to release a thick liquid. It's somewhere in between madhi and mani, semen. So it's a little bit brighter than madhi. So it almost looks like mani, but it's a lot less in its thickness than mani. Kalam Jameel. Some scholars from other schools even suggested that it's a mixture of the two that's being released because of the muscles that are being tensing up at that moment. And if that's the case, then it's a form of madhi or mani. وَمَنِيُّ الْكَلْبِ وَالْخِنْزِيرِ. Why is he saying that? Because mani is tahir. Mani itself, in general, is tahir from humans and animals. But from الكلب والخنزير, it's najis, because every part of the kalb al-khinzir is najis. So is their mani. Jameel. It is almost like the Shafi'iyya, when they were speaking about mani, they were thinking about the dilemma of the Christians and the original sin. You see, if you were to say that mani is najis, then you're saying that a human is starting out with najasa. And there's nowhere in the Sharia that even indicates anything close to that. And there's no way to run away from this. So if you say mani is najis, you are by default stating that that human that's being born is najis, that that animal being born is najis. So these creatures that are supposed to be starting out with a clean slate are now najis. That's a problem. Al-kalam mushkil lil-ghaya. So it must be that with fitra and innocence, وَلَا تَزِرْ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, that these people are what? They're born out of tahara, not najasa. وَلَبَنُ مَا لَا يُؤْكَلُ لَحْمُهُ غَيْرَ الْآدَمِيِّ. Milk of animals that we do not consume is considered what? Najis. غَيْرَ الْآدَمِيِّ. Because we don't consume humans, right? Would their milk be najis? No. Their milk is tahir. And the milk of the animals that we do consume is tahir. وَمَيْتَةُ الْآدَمِيِّ وَالسَّمَكِ وَالْجَرَادِ طَاهِرَاتِ. The mayta, a human that died, he would always be considered mayta. Because there's no way in the Sharia that you can slaughter the Adami in a correct way. Right? These are all tahir. والجزء المنفصل من غير الآدمي والسمك والجراد نجس. someone loses a hand, we're not going to call that hand najis. But there was an old tradition in many civilizations. It still exists till today. And that is, you have your animals and you're in the wilderness and you're hungry or you're thirsty and there's no water around. What they will do is that they'll go to the thighs of the animal and slice a piece off while the animal's still alive. Yep. And they'll cook it and eat it. Or they'll go to the neck of the animal, make a small incision near one of the veins that won't kill them, fill up their container with the blood, and then sew up and patch up the animal. And then hop on the animal's back and continue riding it. And now they'll drink that blood. All of that is najis. All of that is najis. He says, now when it comes to things coming off of animals, illa sha'r al-ma'kul, the hairs, the fur of ma'kul. You might play around with an animal and it's on you. That's not najis. Warishuhu, and its feathers. Wawabaruhu, that's the skin. But wabar refers to thicker skin that just falls off. Wasufuhu, the wool. Walmisk, wafa'ratuhu, wa infahatuhu. Misk and the fa'ra, those two are usually together. Why? Because these are misk, it's referring to musk pods. They're growths that happen on animals, especially deer, and they fall off. And you crack open the pod, and that's where musk comes from, or where it used to come from. Today, everything's now artificial. Wal-unfaha are the enzymes that they take from the inner stomachs of animals to use in cheese. I wanted to continue a little bit more, but we'll stop here, inshallah ta'ala, bi'idhnillah, and we'll start in, you know something? No, let's continue, inshallah, this segment, and we'll start on tayammum in our next class, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. He says, فَصْلٌ فِيمَا يَطْهُرُ وَمَا لَا يَطْهُرُ وَتَطْهُرُ الْخَمْرَةُ إِذَا تَخَلَّلَتْ بِنَفْسِهَا. If the way they used to make khamr a long time ago is that they would put juice into a barrel and they'll seal that barrel. The barrel goes through a couple stages before it gets to vinegar. In the middle of that process, it turns into khamr or wine. Okay. When the prohibition came down of khamr, most people were dumping their barrels. Some discovered that they had barrels and containers elsewhere that they had never disposed of. When they went to open it, it was no longer khamr, it was vinegar. So they came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, Ya Rasulullah, this is the case that happened and it's now vinegar. Can I use it? He said yes. So this one changed into vinegar on its own without any intervention. After people came and he said yes, other people that found that they had it, that was still khamr, they came to him and said, Ya Rasulullah, I have containers of khamr. Can I leave it or change it into khal? He said, no. So if the juice were to transform into khal on its own without any intervention, without any adjustments and moving around from you, because they'd have to move it around back into the sun and back into the shade at different intervals, Jamil, then it's okay. If not, then it's a problem. He says, وَكَذَلِكَ النَّبِيذُ مِنَ التَّمْرِ وَالزَّبِيبِ. So it'll be all types of wine, basically. وَجِلْدُ الْمَيْتَةِ إِذَا دُبِغْ. Prophet ﷺ was walking with the Sahaba down the road one day, and they see a dead animal on the side of the road. He said, what's going on with this? They said, it's mayta, ya Rasulullah. So they acknowledge, they have that understanding that this is mayta, it's najis, we can't use it. He says, the Prophet ﷺ responds and says, أَلَا انْتَفَعْتُمْ بِإِهَابِهَا? They ask him how? He says, بِالدِّبَاغ. And that's the process called tanning. We still use it to this very moment. We might use chemicals. Back in the old days, they used to use bird feces and skin of the pomegranate. You mix them together, they become very acidic, and it burns off fats that are on the skin. So if you take the hide from a mayta and run it through the process of dibagh, you can use it. He says, وَإِذَا تَنَجَّسَ شَيْءٌ بِبَوْلِ كَلْبٍ أَوْ خِنْزِيرٍ أَوْ فَرْعِ أَحَدِهِمَا, something got filthy, became filthy by the urine, for example, of a dog or a swine or one of their offspring, أَوْ لُعَابِهِ, or its saliva, أَوْ أَرَوَثِهِ, its droppings and casting, أَوْ عَرَقِهِ, or its sweat, أَوْ بَدَنِهِ, or moist from the body, وَهُوَ رَطْبٌ, and it's moist, then that needs to be washed. How many times? غُسِلَ سَبْعًا إِحْدَاهُنَّ بِتُرَابٍ طَاهِرٍ طَهُورٍ. Needs to be washed 7 times. In one of those 7 times, you're going to add dirt with the water. Jameel. Now, it's recommended that you use the dirt somewhere in the beginning, so that way the last rinse is a rinse, and you don't have to wash it again afterwards. Now, what if the dirt itself got filthy because of the dog, for example? Because, dogs will look for cool areas to lay on. Dirt is usually a prime location for them. Then you just wash it 7 times with water, since the dirt is already there. وَمَا تَنَجَّسَ بِبَوْلِ صَبِيٍّ لَمْ يَطْعَمْ غَيْرَ اللَّبَنِ نُضِحَ وَهُوَ رَشُّهُ بِالْمَاءِ مَعَ الْغَلَبَةِ وَالْمُكَاثَرَةِ. A young male child that's still breastfeeding, if he were to urinate somewhere, then all you'll have to do is spray, splash, sprinkle water over that area and make sure it's covering it. Well, not the female. Why not the female? 2 reasons. The first reason is there are hormones and bacteria in female urine that are not found in male urine, which is one of the reasons why females, their private area is very easily infected as opposed to the male. So you don't know what type of hormones or infections or sickness that it might cause or might be carrying, not cause, but carrying because of the hormone release. That's one. Number 2, the male organ is like a hose. It's somewhat controllable, as opposed to female, it more splatters than how the male organ functions. There might be other reasons that we are unaware of. Bottom line, for the believer, the hukm of the sharia is suffice. For the searcher and seeker to learn more and understand more, those answers, inshallah, should be suffice. وسائر النجاسات تطهر بالغسل أو بالغسل إذا زال طعمها ولونها وريحها. Any other type of filth other than the dog and the swine, and other than that child's urine, kalam jameen, those are 3 different categories. Minor najasa from that child that we mentioned, major najasa, dog, swine, and anything that branches off of that, and all other najasa. You simply need to wash it, and your goal is to remove its color, taste, and smell. But if a stain is left, or not a stain, but a scent is left, that's okay if you're unable to remove it after trying repeatedly. Can't be both at the same time. ولا يضر بقاء لون أو ريح عسر زواله ولا يطهر المائع إذا تنجس. Other liquids other than water, once they become filthy, that's it. You can't, imagine we have less than qullatain or qullatain of coffee, and najasa has fallen into it, you can't add more coffee to it. It's not going to correct the problem. That's it. It's done. That's why if you recall at the beginning of najasat, what did he say? وَيَنْجُسُ الْمَاءُ الْقَلِيلُ وَغَيْرُهُ مِنَ الْمَائِعَاتِ وَلَوْ بِتَكْمِيلِهِ قُلَّتين. That وَلَوْ بِتَكْمِيلِهِ قُلَّتين goes back to al-ma'i'at, not the water. Tamam? And here we'll stop inshallah ta'ala. And we'll pick up from tayammum in our next class بإذن الله. وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله تعالى لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.